Unknown. Written by Divide. Chapter 3. Vigilant. Fire. Fire everywhere, with smoke clouding my vision and flames licking my legs. I couldn't feel it yet, but I knew I would soon. I couldn't move. I was tied to something with my arms behind my back, and I could do nothing to free myself. All around me people laughed and talked vigorously, paying no attention to me as I slowly burned. The flames were growing larger. They looked like snakes as they began to wrap around my torso, waiting for the right moment to sink their teeth into my flesh. One of the people separated themselves from the crowd and walked over to me, drink in hand. He spoke to me in an unfamiliar tongue, and when I didn't respond, he threw his drink in my face. It smelled and tasted like gasoline. The flames began to grow. My suit began to melt, and the molten metal and Kevlar were burning holes right through my body. I looked up into his eyes and saw my melting face reflected into his. He smiled. I smiled back and waited for the end, silent except for the sound of sizzling flesh. Juggernauts never screamed. With a jolt, I woke up. My heart was beating a mile a minute, and I could hear it echo within my skull. I sat up and removed my helmet, ripping the gas mask off as soon as I could. I rested my head in my hands. If this is what normal people experience on a daily basis upon going to sleep, I did not envy them. I wished that I could go back to my dreamless unconsciousness within the cryogenic chamber, but that was a feat I doubted I could accomplish. Send me to war, and my heartbeat would only be slightly elevated. Put me to sleep, and it was the loudest part of me. I eyed the discarded gas mask and the gift basket beside me. To eat, I had to remove my gas mask. I had already done this a few times without consequence, so I figured that if the air was poisonous, I would be dead already, even if the effects took time to present themselves. I had been a dead man walking for most of my remembered days. My hunger was the final push of my decision. I grabbed one of the fruits and sniffed it tentatively. I couldn't place it, but it smelled different, fresh. I bit into it and was surprised by the crisp and coolness of the flesh and how much juice there was. The cold that continued to radiate from the chambers probably had something to do with it. Sweet, but also tart. The flavor burst on my tongue and this juice dribbled down my chin. It was the single greatest thing I could have remembered tasting. I devoured almost the entire fruit. There were some small black seeds within the center that I didn't bother with, instead choosing to spit them out. The center of the fruit wasn't nearly as delicious as the rest, but it was still a step above any of the food within the kitchen. I grabbed another one, then another one, and another one. I forced myself to stomp out of the fourth one, resided comfortably within my stomach. There was roughly 20 of the fruits still left in the basket, and I wanted to conserve them for as long as possible. I had to force myself away from them. I grabbed my helmet and put it on as an added layer of discouragement. I thought about what the fruit and large article of clothing were meant to represent. It was obviously some sort of appeasement. Food and shelter, perhaps? Was the fabric meant as a blanket? I unfolded it. It was square and roughly twice the height in both directions. I couldn't feel the texture with my gloves on, but it was strong enough to resist my attempt to tear it. I could think of many future uses for it already. Did the creatures know I was alone? Or I slept? I stopped breathing and listened, suddenly paranoid. How much had they explored? What did they know? To take my mind off the possibilities, I walked through the kitchen, purposefully avoiding the blood trail that acted somewhat like an escape route embedded in the floor. I passed the body of the man wearing the chef's apparel, still impaled like a spit roast. I felt a small pang of guilt as I kept walking. At some point, I had to start cleaning up the mess of blood and guts from the various people and creatures. They should have begun to decompose already, but the ship remained unnaturally cold and preserved the tissue from rotting, so I felt no rush to become a janitor. I was concerned about the lack of corpses, however. On a ship this size, the crew should have numbered in the hundreds, but I had only found half a dozen bodies at most. That also brought up the question of where they all slept. The left side of the ship, the parts of which I was most familiar with, consisted of the cryogenic chamber room, the kitchen and arming room, and the one entrance to the hangar. On the right side, there was a cockpit, the massive engine room, and the other avenue of access into the launching bay. Nowhere that I had seen was there sleeping accommodations for non-Juggernaut personnel. After paranoia made me check the hangar, and I confirmed there were no creatures within, I returned to the cockpit and started digging through the wreckage. There had to be some sort of entrance hidden from view. I could feel it, a nagging sensation that I was missing something in plain sight. When I pushed aside a large piece of machinery that I was unfamiliar with, I saw an out-of-place smooth piece of metal protruding from the wall. I stared at it for several seconds before realizing what it was. A lever. Feeling a strange sense of trepidation, I grabbed it and pulled down. The whir of machinery, loud within the dead ship, heralded the trapdoor's awakening beneath my feet. I quickly stepped backwards, crunching some now worthless computer parts beneath my boots. The trapdoor raised with an ominous slowness, squeaking as it did. I waited until the whirring stopped before bending over and examining the depths. I saw several stairs leading downwards, but the floor and anything beyond was undecipherable. It was pitch black. Submachine gun in hand, I ducked my head and descended into the darkness. It was dark enough that I forced to turn on my tiny light attached to the side of my helmet to be able to see where I was going. Once, an almost indistinguishable amount of years ago, I was aboard a submarine. The corridors that I was traversing were uncomfortably reminiscent of that time. I barely fit in the passageway, forced about my head and tucked my shoulders in. The process was slow going. The fact that the lower level was laid out like somewhat of a maze didn't make it any easier. I must have taken a dozen wrong turns before eventually wading into the place I was searching for. The living quarters. There was nothing alive about them now. The amount of dried blood was tremendous. Bunk leads lay twisted and mangled, some with their occupants inside. Cracked open footlockers were strewn every which way, exposing people's clothes, journals, and other personal items. Somehow people fit their entire lives into a metal container, no longer than my leg, and no wider than my arm. I suppose it was better than giving it up entirely. I paced through the remains of the room and started counting the bodies. The corpses that were still in one piece were the easiest to count, but not all had 4 limbs and a head to their name. After piecing together the more spread out ones, I counted roughly 16 fallen crew members, the majority of which were male. I was still missing about 20 or so personnel, but I assumed they would be found in time. Either that or the local wildlife had taken them. As I turned to leave, my curiosity sated and my nose twitching from the beginnings of tissue degradation, I heard a rustle behind me. I spun around, weapon outstretched, cocked and ready. Another rustle. Slowly I walked towards the source of the sound, kicking any debris out of the way as I went. I heard a whimper and a softly spoken cry for help. I stopped and looked down. Below me was an outstretched hand, and behind that, a bloody, bruised, and very much alive face looking up at me. If they hadn't made a noise, I wouldn't have noticed, as there were other bodies nearly suffocating whoever still clung to life. Someone else had survived. The thought brought anxiousness. I considered turning around and walking away, but a wave of guilt stalled my motion. I had already failed to do my duty once. I didn't intend to do so again. Glancing behind me and making sure nothing had followed me, I clicked the safety and stowed my submachine gun away. Hands now free, I reached on the section of mangled bedding struts. With more area to work, I quickly went about picking up and moving the deceased to free the survivor. I gave the dead as much respect as I could under their circumstances. When the last of the bodies were moved, I gingerly picked up the survivor and carried her to the front of me, draped over my arms. A fireman's carry was not practical in such a situation. I glanced down at the frail body that I held. The survivor was a woman, dressed in what looked like shredded pajamas. She was missing her left arm from the bicep down. I heard mumbled whispers of thanks and prayers as I delved back into the catacombs towards the exit, the only light coming from my helmet. As I climbed up the steps that led into the cockpit, I heard several bangs in a quick succession coming from the hole that I had covered the previous day. Because curious horse creatures were exactly what I needed right now. Gritting my teeth and crediting the woman in a single arm, I kicked the metal desk that I had purposely left as an added weight off the metal sheeting and pulled the sheet myself to free my hand. A wide-eyed looking creature looked up at me. I stared at the creature for a few seconds before realizing it was the same horned green-blue creature that had approached me before I collapsed the hangar ramp. It glanced between myself and the injured crew member, then licked its lips and spoke to me again. I still didn't understand the point it was trying to convey, and I didn't have time to make sense of it. I pointed at it and made a shooing motion, similar to how I made the 3 smaller creatures understand. It ignored me and kept chattering, this time pointing at one of its limbs at the now unconscious woman cradled in the crook of my arm. I had no time for charades. For the first time since awakening in my cryogenic freezer, I had to rush. I let out a rumbling growl, and the creature seemed to understand that, for its head disappeared, and I could hear it clonking down the makeshift ramp as it retreated. I replaced the metal sheet and desk before jogging down the hallway towards the cryogenic chamber room. I remembered that there should be first aid kits there. With any luck, they still would be. There we go. I expect to see much more unknown now that I finished with my specials and stuff like that. So I'll be going back to my normal schedules, probably do diaries tomorrow if I can, and then another TCP and then continue my normal. What is abnormal, however, is how much I love my Patreons. Thank you to my Tier 1 Patreons Chase the Master, Squall Windfeather, Starlight Blaze, Nine Tiny Equine, Rain Flicker, Dreamless Portal, and Stu Hex. My Tier 2 Patreons Captain Blue Shadow, Sword Brother and Mordred, Solus, HKH4 aka Texture, and The Animated Ghost. And of course a large, massive thank you to Silent Titan. I appreciate you guys' support so much and it means a ton to me. That aside, however, if you want other ways to support me, well, your viewership is more than enough. However, leaving a like, comment, and of course subscribing does mean a lot to me, and I appreciate it a ton. Anyways, this has been Firehearth. Have a wonderful day.